Welcome back to the Innovative Agency, everybody. Sharon Toerek here with you again. And I am really thinking a lot these days about the amount of transition and evolution you're all experiencing in your businesses as agency owners and leaders right now. And some of you are thriving on all the chaos that's happening for agencies at the moment as we're sitting here, early fall 2025. Some of you are making decisions about what it means for your businesses or what it means for yourselves as owners and leaders. And so part of that conversation is how do you make the most out of the asset you have while it's sitting there in front of you, the agency, of course. And so I'm thrilled to have a conversation today with Nick Avaria. Nick is the founder of Acquisitions .io, and he's also got an experience set that is very unusual for someone who focuses on agency scaling and profitability right now, which is what we're going to talk about today, including what gets us hung up, and what makes us succeed when we're ready to make those choices about when and how to scale our businesses. And so, Nick, first of all, thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me on, Sharon. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation. And so just to set the stage, I'm going to let you describe how you help agency owners, but you're a former agency owner, or maybe actually a current agency owner yourself. You've
Current.
scaled two agencies, that much I know.
Yeah.
Um, and now you're doing exactly what to help agencies? I'll let you sort of tell the story
Yeah.
of how you help them.
I'll give you a quick background here. In my time in agency, which is over a decade now, I've bought and sold over seven agencies to date. I currently own two, so it's not like I don't have a background in agency and or I'm giving people like help from a standpoint of like, hey, this is what was worked 20 years ago or whatever have you. Like I'm still implementing this stuff. And I am a believer that the thing that I can help people with the most is doing the things that I've already done, like, and not straying from that road. And so, what
Mhm.
have I done? It's like I've bought and sold agencies, I've helped scale agencies, my own and other people's. And one of the most important things that I did in the two agencies that I currently own is that I actually manage both of them in anywhere between like 2 hours a week to maybe 10 hours a week on a busy week, like when we have things like offsites and things like this.
Yeah. So
And
still in
so
the
I've,
trenches. Yeah.
yeah, so I've been able to replace myself out of my own businesses. And now I'm doing, agency consultations through agency acquisitions,
Okay.
right? That's really the crux of it. And how this all kind of came about was that I was just kind of, slowly replacing myself out of my own agency. I had I had a very specific goal in mind, which is like I actually got married. And I was like, and we got married in the middle of like, 2020. So it was like it was hard to travel, so we had to postpone our honeymoon during that time.
Mhm.
And my goal was we had this honeymoon set in the future, and we were like, hopefully we can travel, things like that by that date. And I was like, I want to be able to reduce the number of hours that I work within my own agency to like 10 hours a week by that point. So I like had this artificial due date, right?
Mhm.
Because
Got
I
it.
was like the typical person that could not escape from behind their desk.
Mhm.
And I was working, and this is not an exaggeration. I was working some weeks 60 hours, and that was a light week. There were
Mhm.
are other weeks where I was working 80 hours, 100 hours, like 6, 7 days a week, right? Like working
Mhm.
all the time.
Mhm.
And it was just like not tenable anymore.
Yeah.
And so I went down this path of trying to make myself, non-essential to the business, basically. And during, those few months that I did this, took like a little bit less than a year, half a year-ish. I basically hit my goal. And by that time, I was only necessary to the business about 8 hours a week. It
Mhm.
didn't mean that that was all I worked. It just meant like if there was 8 hours a week of critical material that only I could do.
Got it.
The rest of the time, I still was working hard, but I was working on the business on things that would take us forward rather than like things that needed to be done for the wheels not to fall off. And
Got it.
over time, I've now gotten that the time that it takes to prevent the wheels from falling off is now down to 0 hours. And the things that are value add for me are probably, again, in that like 3 to 10 hour range. And then
Mhm.
obviously I can work more if I want.
Right.
But ultimately, like that is what I help people with, is like how to like free yourself of the chains of that while generating better profitability and better scalability for your business.
That is a great jumping off point for one of the many things I want to ask you about. And we're going to get into sort of how you help agency owners think about and analyze scale and profitability challenges. But I feel like since you shared that detail, that very important detail about where your mindset was at the time you made the choice to change, to talk about owner mindset. And I think it's an important conversation for a couple of reasons, but I think it's crucial right now because you and I were exchanging a little bit of conversation before we hit record today. And, what I shared with you is that I think that we're in a era right now where, I mean, the agency world is always transitional. There's always a lot of change management. There's always the same pressures that any other business experiences as well, too, when it comes to the economy and everything else. But we're in the middle of kind of a storm right now, I think, in the agency world, because not only um, have economic headwinds been a little tricky for agencies this year, but the entire business model and the pressures on it are changing because of AI and what the
Yeah.
expectations are around it. And so, and the point of all that is that there's some agency leaders who are at a decision and inflection point about um, do I even want to scale at all? Which I know you've got a point of view about that. And if I do, what are the things I need to be thinking about, working on, and in what order? And why? And I want to start with
Mhm.
the why because you had a very specific why for why you made the transition and so talk about that for a minute about making the decision about whether you want to scale and whether the timing's right or whether you want to make another decision in your business, including exiting it, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, speaking specifically to like the time, I think that, I mean, quite frankly, like during 2020, when everything, like we had lockdowns and things like that, a lot of agencies that had digital components, it was actually like a huge windfall. So, I mean, there
Yeah.
was like a period of like 2, 3 months, maybe four, where things got really, really bad. But then there was like this boom because it forced like so much digital transformation to happen, and
Right.
agencies caught the windfall of that. So that downturn for us wasn't too bad. I still do remember like the 2008 downturn, like that was like much, much worse because it was much more prolonged, etc. But even then, agencies had a windfall because people were firing their internal teams and hiring agencies. So, they would let go of their internal team for, 30, 40 grand. They would say, hey, agency, can you do this for like 5 or 6K plus media spend? And boom, they had a cost benefit for the company of like 2 to 1, right? They were saving 50% of their
Mhm.
marketing costs. And this is just like a quick point to touch on. I do think that agencies are like anti-fragile in that sense, where when the economy is in a downturn, people will go with the internal teams for the favor of agencies. What agencies don't do well in is in times of uncertainty, like before the firings happen at the client side. That's not a good time for agencies because once the layoffs begin, that's where agency contracts begin to flow. And I just don't think we're quite there yet. But I'll say, first of all, that I do think that there's light at the end of this tunnel sooner than later. We're kind of recording here at the beginning of fall.
Mhm.
I would be very surprised if this like winter, if you want to call it that, will last much more than like 4 or 5 months, where people begin to re-outsource to agencies for a number of reasons once
Mhm.
again, right? I think the layoffs are already starting to happen. So, I mean, generally tech is the canary in the coal mine. We're already seeing that.
Mhm.
But what this does is what we need to take into consideration for the mindset perspective is like, why do you want to scale and or sell and or what I would even call like become non-scalable, because all of these things have very specific trade-offs.
Mhm.
I think that if you are looking to sell, now is probably going to be a good time to start getting your house in order, because I depends who's listening. selling is not something that you do overnight. It's not something
Right.
that's going to take 3 months. It's not something that it's going to take 6 months, unless you've been operating the company in a very tight way where it has been meant to sell all along. Chances are the prep process is going to take you 9 to 12 months on the low end,
Yeah.
right? Now, if you're one of those few people that it's like your books are tight, your cap table's clean, all your systems are in place, and all these other things, like congratulations, you're part of a very small minority
Yeah.
of businesses that can even sell in the next 6 months. By the way, like, it's highly rare to see this because even the people that do it purposefully, all it generally does is cut the time to go like truly list and be attractive for a buyer. It cuts down the time from, 18 months ish or so
Mhm.
down to maybe 6 months. So it's just less work that you got to do.
A hundred
But
percent.
if you're thinking about selling, now is probably the time because I do think that the agency landscape is going to go through transformation specifically because of AI, but also because of I think we're in sort of like a talent war. And based on who I work with, the number one problem that everybody's having is that of finding the appropriate level of talent, that high level of talent, because at the end of the day, what an agency truly is a ball of systems and people. That's all it is because we don't own machinery, we don't own like trucks or whatever else have you, like warehouse space. It's just people and systems. And for agencies to do well, we need to have better systems and better people than our clients. That's our competitive advantage.
Mhm.
And I think that the people side is going to get progressively more difficult in the next 1 to 5 years. It's just going to get harder and harder, which means payroll is going to go up more and more, which is going to put pressure on agencies to pay more and therefore narrow their margins unless there's some sort of commensurate like price increases or whatever have you.
Mhm.
If you want to sell before that transition begins of having all of these things happen, for one, I'm going to go on record and say that I think this has already begun. This is sort of like the inevitability of it.
Mhm.
If you want to sell, you need to do so fairly quickly, and get that process started as soon as you possibly can.
Mhm.
If your choice though is to stay in the game for another like 3 to 5 years, I think that there's different considerations at play of what is to come. And do we want to be a scalable enterprise, like a scalable business or a non-scalable business?
Right. So let's talk. Let me. That's a great um, opportunity for me to ask this of you. If you've let's decided you're in it to win it for another 3 to 5 years, as you stated. Um, Talk to me about the mindset of the owner who has to choose between the decision of scaling or intentionally not doing so, and sort of what the thinking patterns that you see, the successful thinking patterns you see amongst owners who have to make that choice.
Yeah. Um, the biggest pattern that like I've seen, and it's almost like a decision tree of like, should I scale, should I not scale, really? There are trade-offs in the short, medium, and long term. So we have to look at this differently.
Hmm.
Non-scalable agencies, meaning agencies that require their owner to operate, meaning like you can take a vacation. So I mean, like when I say non-scalable, I don't mean you can't take a vacation without checking your email. Like you can absolutely do that for like 1 or 2 weeks. But if you're
Hmm.
pushing it past 2 weeks, it's like like that might not go so well for you. So
Hmm.
it's going to require a little bit of planning before, and you're going to have a little bit of catch up when you get back, right? Like that's what I mean by non-scalable. The scalable version is like you can go away for a quarter and everything's just fine, right? Because ultimately you can replace yourself with like a CEO, president, whatever have you. Here's the trade-offs though. The non-scalable businesses, especially the ones doing below, I would say $3 million in top line revenue per year, are way more profitable.
Mm.
And this is like the reality. Like I hate to be the person to break it to you, but I think we know that as agency owners, we wear a lot of hats,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
Part of the hats that we wear is often bringing in the strategic thinking at a very senior level, which enables us to hire people that are, quite frankly, cheaper than we would otherwise require if we were not in the room. Quick example of this, right? If you are not like, if like a lot of owners, some of the hats that they let go of last is the marketing of the actual agency. And by marketing, I mean how we as an agency generate leads, how
Got
we
it.
do sales, and the leadership functions of the agency, right? Those are the three last bastions because generally people let go of admin first, then they let go of product delivery, then they let go of accounts. So, meaning being like the primary point of accounts, then is usually marketing, then sales, then leadership. Like that's what I would call the replacement ladder,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're in those last three items, replacing yourself out of those functions becomes very, very expensive, right? Because
Right.
the talent that's required is more rare. And salaries are commensurate to rarity of skill and nothing else, right? How
Right.
likely it is that you can find something successful. So when you're talking about things like delivering the product, you can pay reasonable amounts, replace yourself out of delivering product. Accounts, there's a lot of account directors that are great that can manage an entire accounts team. Now, when you start getting into the sales and marketing, though, like this is where it changes. And then when you get into leadership, it becomes extremely costly. So
Mm-hmm.
when you're in a non-scalable model, you can, for example, have like a sales director or a marketing director or an operations director where you are basically supplementing a lot of the strategic thinking moving forward of even like some of those people in those roles. So you're basically helping them do the role. And it's not that you're helping them do the role, it's that you are bridging the gap between a director level and a VP level or like a C-suite level
Right.
through your like ownership lens, which makes things a lot cheaper, which means that the profit's going to be a lot higher because your alternative is instead of hiring, some director of one of these functions that's going to cost you, if you're paying appropriately for the right talent or skill to be scalable, call it like, 130 to like 200K a year, you are going to pay them 100 to 130 in the non-scalable version, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
much cheaper to pay that individual and then supplement what they are doing with your ownership slash CEO lens,
Mm-hmm.
right? So people are going to become a lot more expensive, and then differential goes to the bottom line. In addition, those types of people are generally not doers, meaning like they are executives. When you go the scalable route, they're executives and they are strategic level people. They're not going to go on sales calls. They're not going to go and actually do the work. They're going to hire people to do the work. So not only are their salaries more, they're actually going to hire people to do the actual work on
Mm-hmm.
top of it. Whereas if you go the non-scalable route, you get less strategic thinking and things like that, but they're also more apt to actually do the work. So you need less staff in that function.
Right. So, in your view, and I want to get to the scalable, the decision to scale versus not, as well, but I have a follow-up question based on what you just said about what is basically a purposeful and intentional decision not to scale, right? You've decided to retain profitability, keep things tighter. What, in your experience, are the likelihoods of actually exiting that business at any point in time if you've made a strategic decision not to scale it? Because I think there's some common perceptions about what they are, and I'm not going to, tip my hat to what those might be, but I do want to get your perspective on can you ever actually sell a business that you've intentionally chosen not to scale?
That non-scalable business is a lot harder to sell.
Yeah.
Like a lot harder to sell unless you're incredibly strategic about the decisions that you're making inside of it,
Hmm.
right? Um, I mean, as some people may know, the second that the primary owner is required to do certain things, the valuation starts going down. So it's not
Right.
necessarily that it's not like you can't sell it. It's just that you're not going to sell it for the multiples that the market that you're seeing where people tell you, I got like 5x, I got
Yeah.
8x on my EBITDA or whatever have you. It's like a lot harder to do that, right? There's probably
Right.
like a multiple there. It might be that the fit is going to be like a much more strategic buyer. And it also might be the fact that like, it's like, hey, maybe you're doing $1 million in EBITDA and you get like a 4 or 5x valuation, but you're also locked in for 4 years. And of that valuation, you're only going to get 25% up front, and the rest of it is on an earnout where it's like you need to maintain the business. So you're basically an employee for the next 3 or 4 years
Yeah.
after that, and like the money's going to be like tranched, right?
Or you divert cash out of the business along the way because you're more profitable and you do other things with it.
The real trade-off that you're basically looking to do though, and I'm going to speak specifically to a 3 to 5 year timeline. The biggest problem with like scaling is, again, I'm going to go back to the people, because like even just because you're paying somebody 150K, 200K, 300K a year to do a job doesn't mean that they're going to enable you to scale. Like it is like a bit of a needle in the haystack moment where you got to really find the right person, and that's not easy.
Mhm.
So paying the money is not enough to get the performance. So there's a lot more things that can go wrong in the scaling model, and you got to be willing to, frankly, work more. So, in a really strange way, the front end of scaling is way more work than the non scalable model. Because if you say to yourself, well, I'm going to make this in a non scalable fashion, but I'm going to be needed as little as possible, but I am essential,
Mhm.
you can figure out really nice ways of doing that where other people are doing like 90% of the work or 98% of certain tasks, and you're only essential for a little bit of it, right? Which is
Right.
very different from being 100% non-needed. Like that, the higher the percentage of replaceability, the progressively harder it gets. It's actually like on sort of like an exponential curve. The closer you get to like 100%, the harder it is to replace yourself, and the more expensive it is to replace yourself.
Right, right, right. So that's very telling and actually I think encouraging because I think for some agency owners who are who drink a lot of the Kool-Aid with along with their peers about scaling, getting bigger, you know, making a purposeful decision not to scale doesn't feel like a viable option for them because they've sort of been fed a story about how it's not ambitious enough or how
Mm,
it's not growth focused enough. But it's
yeah.
in my view, it's growth in a different form. Um, but for everybody else who does want to make an intentional decision to scale, to not be integral to the day to day, and who wants that pathway to the higher multiple because they have a scaled business.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about, based on your experience helping other agencies through it and having gone through it yourself a couple of times, what are some of the biggest challenges you see agencies stumble through? A- First of all, are they always intentional about it? I guess I should lead with that question. And
Yeah.
once they've just started to scale or they've started to do it, whether it was intentional or not, what are some of the biggest hurdles you're seeing them face?
The Here's, I guess, the positive, okay? Tying in the non-scalable to the scalable. In my opinion, the correct path is to be non-scalable, then scalable. And there's like all these famous quotes that I can cite, but like one of them is from one of the founders of Airbnb, where like they're like, "What's the best advice you ever got?" And they said, "Make your product non-scalable, make it awesome, and then figure out a way to make it scalable after it's already awesome in that non-scalable way."
Got it.
And so the true path of being scalable is very similar to the scalable path. In fact, it is step one, in my opinion. And this
Okay.
is for various reasons. So when you are non-scalable, you are more profitable because you're not hiring more expensive people yet, right?
Mhm.
The whole point of being non-scalable is there is no path of non-scalability where the profit doesn't go up. So I want to be very clear about that. If you're making the choice to be non-scalable, the profit needs to be going up as an outcome of that choice.
Got
Okay?
it.
And this is essential for non-scalability. It's also essential for the path to scalability because we need to build up the cash position and or profit of the business. Why? Because once we go from the non-scaling into the scaling part of the journey, we're going to start burning way more money on way more senior level talent. Like I said before, that's not going to do the work. They're going to be the senior thinking talent. They're going to hire other people to actually
Right.
do the work. What's this going to do? Compress your margin. So guess what? if you're doing between 5 and 15% margin, maybe even 20%, once you start hiring these really expensive people, you're going to go down into single digits, might even go negative. But
Mm.
guess what? If you do the non-scalable path first, where you're getting to 25, 30, 35% profit, or maybe even higher, once you start hiring this more senior level talent to complete the transition to scalability, you can afford it and still be reasonably profitable
Got
because
it.
like scaling burns a ton of cash.
Yeah, that
So
makes sense.
the first step, in my opinion, of scale is become non-scalable. And specifically, what I mean is this: you need to enable the systems and the integration of systems to people of the things that you currently do as an agency owner to reduce, not eliminate the amount of things that you do, to reduce the time everything takes. So if something takes you 10 hours, how can you write a process, a training, a whatever it is, so that somebody else can do 90% of it,
Hmm.
95% of it? See, where people get caught up is that they try to do 100%. Like, how can I replace myself 100% from this thing? And it's like, no, no, no. Like, step one is you're going, like, to use like a metaphor here. Imagine you're like a writer, you're graduating from writer to editor,
Got it.
right? It's
Hmm.
like, so graduate to editor first before you graduate to like publisher, which is like, okay, now you have like a number of editors. So
Hmm.
that's the first jump. It's like, okay, make yourself the editor on everything. Once that goes well, then hire another editor, right? So now that's like the management or the director level function that can do even more of it. And maybe you still have a little bit left. And that's where like the executive level individual is going to come in. But the first step is really getting yourself out of the day to day and just becoming the editor and or quality assurance, if you want to call it that, of the process. That's step
Okay.
one. That's
Got
the
it.
non-scalable process.
Got it. Okay.
And
Makes
if you
sense.
just want to do non-scalable, you end the process there. Now you're working way less and you have the option of working more for upside. Step two of the scalability now is like, okay, now that I am only doing the things that only I can do, now I need higher level talent that can also do these things that only I can do now. And now this is where the price point of these individuals is going to get much more expensive, et cetera, et cetera. But now you have the profitability to bear the weight of that,
Hmm.
right? So if you're going
Got
down the
it.
scalable path, because here's the thing: if you're already working 60 hours a week or even just 40 hours a week and you're going to go down the scalability path and start increasing everything, like you're going to bury yourself unless you do step one first.
Right. No, that totally makes sense because you've got to take the handcuffs off in order to empower anybody else to take on any part of the things you're trying to release yourself from, for lack of a better way to put it. And so that's actually a very hopeful way of laying it out, that you can, the first step is the same whether you're going to go one route or the other.
Correct.
So, um, get your house in order that way and document as much about what you're doing and how you're doing it, so you can start to make smart decisions about how to free yourself from those things. All right, so
The
once you're
issue,
there, go ahead.
yeah, the issue is that if you skip step one and go straight into step two, you're going to scale your problems too, right? And so
What
that's
do you
the
mean?
actual
What do you
issue at
mean by
hand.
that? What
So
do you
for example, like if you have a current issue, right, that takes up, let's call it like 5 hours a week of your already busy schedule,
got it?
you start scaling, right? Like revenue, number of clients through the door, whatever else have you, that problem is going to balloon along with everything else. Except that problems aren't necessarily like linear. Meaning, like if you are doing $1 in revenue today and you go to $2, the problem doesn't go from like, oh, well, it's 5 hours today, 10 hours tomorrow when we double. It's going to go exponential on you real fast,
Hmm.
right? In addition, and I think also because of the scale, new problems will appear that didn't appear beforehand because scale puts an immense amount of pressure on the current systems that you have. So like think of it like a dam, right? More water pressure adds on. The areas of the dam that were weak, that were not leaking before, begin to leak. So new leaks spring up every time we put more and more pressure on our systems. So
And what are the
problems
ones
are,
what are the leaks you see most prominently?
yeah. So I mean, like the primary leaks that I see like are breakdowns in actual delivery process of like how to deliver to clients. Clients um, kind of leaking through the cracks, like from a retention perspective. So client retention goes down. Um,
Okay.
Errors made in like administrative tasks like billing. Um, but I would say that the number one issue is like client happiness, like as a KPI, client happiness goes down, then churn goes up. So client retention comes down as well.
Got it. Okay.
And like that is like one of the first things that happens. And like people don't notice it. And this is where people say, oh, well, I just need to increase my sales pipeline. And guess what? It's like, well, you're actually going to put even more pressure because onboarding clients is very time intensive. And because of that time intensivity, you're going to break even more things.
Mhm. It's just it's not funny, but it just reminds me of, somebody who doesn't want to date a lot of people because they don't want to disappoint a lot of people instead of just a few people. That's what it reminds me of, right? I mean, if you're not set up to sustainably serve and fulfill your obligations to a few clients, then you're certainly not going to be able to be set up to do that with an
I
even
think
organization.
the problem that scale entails is this: you might be meeting your client's expectations by accident,
Oh,
right? So meaning
yeah.
like because you and your team have time available, we're checking off the boxes in a non-systemic way where we're doing things kind of by accident almost. But it's
Mhm.
not like a methodology, it's just like what we instinctively do out of instinct. It's not proceduralized. And
Mhm.
therefore, once the pressure's on, we now need to start making trades. It's like, okay, we need to spend less time with this client. We need to do a little bit less, we'll communicate a little bit less. And then the balance of why we're retaining that client is broken because we don't have a recipe on actually how to retain them. It's more so like ad hoc. It's based off of like ethereal like instinct. And as those things get removed, eventually we take one of those things away that breaks the system, and all of a sudden the client retention goes down,
Got it.
right?
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Wow. So, all right. So that is a really
So
great, just go ahead. Yeah.
I would make like, so here's like in my opinion the three things that you need once you decide to even go down the path of non-scalability or scalability. It doesn't
Okay.
matter which. Number one, you need to get your dashboards in order. Why? Because dashboards create the environment to make great decisions consistently. Okay. The better decisions we make and the more we compound those decisions, the better outcomes we're going to get. So like this is the whole like 1 + 1 = 3. We make one good decision, great. We make two great decisions in a row, even better. Three, and so forth. It gets better and better and better with every progressive correct decision we make.
Hmm.
The other side of it is also focusing on the things that move the needle the most. So this is like the whole purpose of dashboards is that they are data feedback loops on what reality is currently throwing at us. So when we, for example, do like net promoter score or some sort of like client facing item, we are basically measuring how happy the client is, how likely they are to stay with us. If we're measuring things like productivity, it's like what is our productivity and what could it potentially be? These are
Hmm.
all feedback loops that we need to incorporate in our business very early on. So the things that you see as an owner, other people can see them too. Except that for owners, because we've been in it from day one, we can kind of like manage these things by feel, right?
Right.
But what our feel and or intuition tells us, that is not coming through to other people. And dashboards are the way to tie that all together in a
Hmm.
succinct manner where we're now all reading off of the same playbook.
Got it. That makes so much sense because the numbers are the numbers. And if you're making decisions based on data that everybody doesn't have the right access to, of course, within bounds, right, as an owner, then it's hard to get them on board with the change you're trying to make, right?
Exactly. And so what generally ends up happening is that the reason that the dashboards are required is so that you can hold people accountable to the things that they're actually responsible for in the first place. So if you do
Yeah.
hire managers, you do hire directors, well, how are you measuring the success of the individual role? Well, you need these things in place before they come your way. And if they're already in, you need to get these in as fast as possible. Because
Hmm.
where the dashboards begin and end, that's where people management takes over, right? So you
Hmm.
need a very specific way of one, like of how you're going to manage people, how you're going to set expectations with people, and how you're going to use that data to ultimately drive behavior change in people,
Got it.
right?
Yeah.
And that's what it creates a feedback loop between the systems and the actual individuals. Data measures the behaviors that the people do. We then read the data, have a conversation with the individuals to understand why the data is showing up the way that it is. We amend their behavior through performance management, and the flywheel keeps going over and over.
Got it. Okay. So data dashboards, data communication, data management. All right, great step. What's the next one?
The second one is basically the people management
Got
side.
it.
So,
Okay.
like, this is where you're assigning specific numbers from the dashboards to the actual individual people.
Okay.
And the performance management is a part of that. It's also about having a leadership and management methodology within your business, right?
Right.
Because one thing that was much more popular decades ago, which is not nearly as popular today, is that we are generally training people on leadership type qualities, essentially, but we're not generally training people on management. And this is like a huge missing piece,
Huh.
right? It's the opposite problem that companies in the 80s and 90s had, where like it was all management, zero leadership. And now we're like in the opposite, where now it's all leadership, very little management. Management's almost caught like this like dirty word vibe, but it's not about leadership versus management. It's what is the correct proportion of each,
Is it
right?
that, but do you mean by that we're not doing enough teaching? We're setting a pace, but we're not showing them the roadmap for how to
That's
keep the
exactly
pace?
what it is.
Okay.
Yes. So
Interesting.
so like like from a leadership perspective, we're casting vision, we're enabling culture, we're doing all the like typical leadership things.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's like, okay, well, how do I do that? It's like, I don't know. Just this is the vision. Like
I
you
don't
should hunt
remember how
after
I
it.
did it. Just figure it
So
out.
yeah, just figure it out. And like in a positive environment, this is very energizing because like it's great. But let people crash against that wall for about like 2, 3 years and tell me how excited they are to work now. They
Yeah.
need like not like leadership charges people up with energy, right? Gets them to like march towards something.
Hmm.
Management just gets them to march in formation. And you need both. If you have
Right.
if you get people in formation and they're not moving, they're not moving. If you get people to like move but not in formation, they're going to end up crashing into each other and it's going to be chaos,
True,
right?
true, true.
So
Yeah, yeah.
you need both in a good breakdown. So like number 2 is really like about people management. Like what numbers are they responsible for? What is the primary objective of every role? How do you how do you quantify the objective of every single role in the business? And then what is the management methodology that your managers are going to use moving forward? So when you hire a brand new manager to the business, they have management skills and they've managed people before. It's like, great, you need that. But this is how we manage here. There needs to be a set methodology for both leadership and management in this business that adheres to the culture of the business, right?
Interesting.
So that's
Yeah.
step number 2.
Okay.
Step number 3 is limiting client turnover. Okay. So, like, this is like the third key element,
Got it.
limiting client turnover. And how do we limit client turnover? Standard operating procedures. Like, this is boring stuff. Okay. Like, standard operating procedures of how we deliver our product, standard operating procedures of how we onboard, how we do sales, how we basically do every single aspect of the business that's client facing, and then creating a great client experience, right? And because we can't just deliver product as an agency, clients expect more of us. And I've kind of boiled it down to like what I call the 3 E's. So you need to
Okay.
drive a great experience, you need to be great at driving the proper expectations, and then you need to give the client a reasonable amount of education. Because often when we as agencies hear like, oh, well, you guys aren't leading me from the client, what that
Mhm.
actually means is I'm not learning anything. You're not telling me anything new. You're just delivering the product. And if you're
Right.
only delivering the product without adhering to expectations, education, and experience, you're
Mhm.
just going to become a regular supplier versus being a strategic partner.
Right. Wow. This is very thought-provoking and actually kind of inspiring in an encouraging way because I think that very entrepreneurial agencies are actually made of the kind of fairy dust that makes them potentially excellent at all these things. It's just a lack of having the perceived bandwidth to knit it all together, you know?
What ends up happening and why owners are so overworked is that the order that I gave these things in dashboards, people systems, and then client retention systems,
Mhm.
owners are trying to uphold step three without
Okay.
one and two in place. And it's basically the equivalent of building a third floor, build like a three-floor building without the first two floors. So
Wow.
basically, what ends up happening is that the owner is holding up the third floor through sheer willpower and like effort because step one and two is not built.
And they get exhausted and then they don't have the energy to that is
And
so true.
eventually when the owner gives up or goes on that vacation and or whatever happens, this is where you lose clients. This is why you have to take client calls while you're on vacation or you can't take time off or whatever else have you, is because you're like, here's the thing, like I've done so many audits on agencies. Like I've done over 200 audits in my lifetime. In the last year I've done 100 just in the last year alone.
No
Okay?
kidding. Okay.
And I audit these three elements every single time. People score really well, or I should say they score way better on client retention systems than
Mhm.
they do the data systems and the people management systems. The problem though is like when I get them, I say like, okay, let's go through this like little mini questionnaire around the retention systems. I'm like, okay, this is the score that you got. Now let's score you if you're not present.
Yeah.
And immediately the score, it's not even that it cuts in half, Sharon. It like goes from like, it's basically out of like a base of 65 points. If they
Mhm.
scored like 45 or 50 points, they're going down to sub 10
Mm.
because the owners are holding up the whole system like on their own. And the reason is because step one and two is what creates the alignment and then assigns the work to individuals so that they can take ownership of the system themselves and it doesn't all fall back onto the owner.
Do you think this is just because of the entrepreneurial tendency to have not enough patience with the sort of mundane day to day that it takes to actually scale over time? I mean, you know, you think about this every once in a while about what does it really take to have longevity in a business or to scale it up if that's what you want to do. And it comes down to really executing what can feel like a lot of really boring stuff day by
That's a
day.
part of it. And I think that it's that and it's also survival. Like it's almost like this like survival instinct that you almost need to override where think about it. It's like you're already working 60 hours a week. If you want to make things scalable, you need to put pen to paper to make them scalable.
Mhm.
Okay, well, how much more time is that going to take? Because look, this is really simple. Doing something is faster than teaching somebody how to do it.
Yeah,
In the short run, in the
right.
middle run, it is way better to teach other people how to do it. But when
Mhm.
you're trying to survive this week, this month, this day, you don't have the presence of mind to say to yourself, I'm going to create a document or training or whatever on how to do this. And when people do it, back to like the beginning of our conversation, people are looking for perfection, meaning how can I 100% get rid of this versus like how can I just get rid of 80% of this or 90% of this,
Yeah.
right?
Wow.
And how
So
you get out of this is very specific. You need to create a list of all the things that you do on a daily basis that are I like start with the direct client stuff, like admin number one, then the direct client stuff, like product delivery and or um, client interactions. Create a
Right.
list of all the things that on a per month basis, how many hours they take. Start writing standard operating procedures, frankly, by like shooting a video of how you do it, and then send it to somebody else. They can write the document.
Hmm. I love this, and I love that what I am always happy about when I complete a conversation on the show is when we have created content that any size agency can implement. And the steps you laid out, and also what you just said immediately now was what, because I was about to ask you, it's almost like you anticipated my question. Okay, where do you start? You're an overwhelmed owner who maybe you do have an intention one way or another, scale or not scale. But even if you don't, where do you start to calm the chaos so that you have even breathing room to decide one way or another?
Yeah.
And I
So
think
if you
actually,
are, yeah, if
yeah,
you're buried, this like the whole like lay out what you do in a month and
brain
assign time
dump.
to it, and then
Yeah.
basically ask yourself, like, if I created a resource for this where not 100% of it was off my plate, but like 90% of it was off my plate, how long would that take? ROI on time. So like if this thing takes me 20 hours, it takes me like 30 hours to do per month. I'm going to get a time savings of 16 hours on this thing, for example. Well, after 2 months, I'm broken even on the time it's going to take me, and I'm actually going to be ahead. Okay,
Mhm.
great. Start there. So, like, literally do an ROI on your time. Don't shoot for perfection. Just shoot for, can this 80 or 90% be done by somebody else?
Mhm.
Then we can work our way up to 100. That's number one. Number two, once you generate enough time through that method, then you need to go immediately into the dashboards, then into the people management, so on and so forth. Then you go down the top three,
Got it.
right?
Yeah.
And by the way, if people are curious about like that dashboard, I can definitely leave behind a link to like a free version of what I
We're
personally use.
definitely, I'm glad you mentioned that because we're coming, unfortunately, to the end of our time together for
Yeah,
this episode. But I can think of a million reasons why I want to continue the conversation with you on future episodes. But meanwhile, why don't you share? We're going to drop some links in our
yeah,
show notes to some of your resources, Nick. And then why don't you tell people the best places to find you and to learn more about what agency acquisitions does for agencies?
sure. So people, if people want to find me, they can find me on LinkedIn, Nick Avaria. I also have a website, agencyacquisitions.io, and I also have a brand new Instagram account that I've barely used, but it's there.
Oh,
I
wow.
also
Okay.
kind of I also post once a week or so, or once every couple of weeks on YouTube to just give away free knowledge and content there.
Great.
Um, yeah, some of the links we're going to include after the show, like that you can download for free. Dashboard template that I use even in my own agencies today, also like a KPI document. And I think because we talked about it, I have a resource of an SOP on how to write an SOP, so you can
Oh,
start like getting those time savings as fast as possible. And yeah, like I said before, what agency acquisitions does, it helps people do exactly what we were talking about on the show today, whether it's like the dashboarding, helping people replace themselves from their own business slowly but surely, improving profits and scale. Like that's exactly what we do.
amazing. This has been a great conversation. It's been inspiring to me as an owner of a business that's not an agency, but can certainly take away a lot from how you've walked through what an owner has to think about and do and implement to make the decision to scale or not scale, and then how to enable that once they make the decision. So, Nick, I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom today on the show. And I know that everybody's going to take away a lot of helpful hints from it for their own agency. So thanks so much for being with us.
Thank
And
you,
thanks to
Sharon.
the rest of you for joining us. It was a great conversation. And until we see you at the next episode, everybody stay well. Take care.